Well, she can talk to me. That's fine. So when she does, I'll just say that you're reviewing the body camera footage right now.
Story about Joe. Tell a good story.
Oh no.
Were you part of it? Because I'm new to the, well, I'm not new to the area, but Documented Teachers Education Association. So my mother-in-law was Karen Schwartz.
Oh, I know your mother.
Yeah, she taught me.
She went on strike with me.
No, she probably did. Yeah. Well, she always tells a story about my wife, who was in college for a track national championship. It was carrying the town.
Welcome back. We'll now go on to the next committee meeting of the Bellingham City Council. That's Public Works, Public Safety. Terry Borneman is the chair.
Thank you, Michael. Joining me on the committee is Roxanne Murphy and Jean Knutson. We have one item on before the committee today, and that's a report on the fireworks enforcement for 2017. Chief Dahl, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. David Dahl, Deputy Chief with the Police Department. And I'm here to introduce to you one of our patrol commanders for the Police Department, Lieutenant Jason Monson, who's going to give you a brief overview of the calls for service, our response, and lessons learned for this year's fireworks seasons.
Okay, I believe you all have a packet. Did you have this one that was from our prepared by our crime analyst, and then you got the, is this in that as well?
Yes.
It is, okay. And then you've got the PowerPoint as well?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So in that packet, I'm just going to go to slide 1 here. Is that on? Which is actually slide 2. And that just shows our fireworks calls that we received between July 1st and July 5th. If you total all those up, we had 182 fireworks calls for service, if you go across the board there. And what I really like to do is I kind of drill down, take a closer look at those numbers, and explain them a little further and kind of put it in perspective. So after analyzing every one of those calls, and believe me, I looked at every one of them, I found that based on the date, time, and location of the calls, we had many callers reporting the same incident, which is to be expected, right? If somebody lights off a bunch of fireworks at 2 in the morning, we're going to get several people calling about that. But in our computer-aided dispatch system, each one of those phone calls to the 911 center logs as a call, and that's what you're seeing here. So, and I know you've had a lot of calls, emails about the fireworks complaints, and we did too. And so I kind of want to put things in a little perspective here, because those calls are important. So if you look at, and just based on what I said on the number of calls we get, if you look at July 1st, we had 14 calls, but the number of incidents we actually had were only 10. 10 incidents, but 14 calls to the 911 center. One of those being the Bellingham Bells fireworks display was one of the calls we had that day. And we did have an officer actually go out and talk to those folks, and they were permitted by the fire department to put that display on. July 2nd, as you can see, we had 26 fireworks calls, but really when you look at it, we only had 7 incidents. And 10 of those actually were, like I mentioned, a call at 2 in the morning where a bunch of people in the neighborhood called, and that's what happened there. July 3rd, we had 33, but really we only had 16. July 4th, 96 calls of fireworks to 911. But when you look at it all, really there were only 55 separate incidents, but 96 calls on that. So roughly, between July 1st and July 5th, 182 calls, but when you pare it down to just the incidents, we only had 100 incidents over those 5 days. But actually, we had an emphasis patrol out as well on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and I'll get to the emphasis patrol in a little bit. Our emphasis patrol had officers generating calls as well. So of those 100 actual fireworks calls, 11 of those were generated by officers pulling numbers, generating a fireworks complaint, writing reports. So that is added to the total as well. So really, when you pare it all down, we really only had 89 incidents over that 5-day period.
Jason, I'd like to address one thing that we received some email inquiries from, as did I think some of you, about what we display on our web page in terms of law enforcement activity or police activity. When you look at our police activity for July 4th, it lists that we had 1 firework call. Up there it says 96, so what happened? And when I saw that number too, I said, there's no way we just got 1 fireworks complaint on July 4th. And as it turns out, we do have a new computer-aided dispatch system right now that is not communicating very well with our records management system. So we're in the process of fixing that. So when citizens look at the daily police activity, in the future, that is indeed what they will see. Because that was a little bit, I was very concerned with that. So if you received that question from some of your constituents, that's what happened in that case. And we're working on fixing that.
What's not on that slide is Friday, June 30th, which I thought maybe because of a Friday we would have a lot of calls. I don't think we had any. I think we had 1, and then on Thursday, July 6th, we didn't have any calls. So I didn't put those on the slide there. So I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. If you add all those up across the board, 182 incidents, but in reality, or 182 calls for service to 911, but in reality, only 100 incidents. 11 of them we generated ourselves by checking Cornwall Park, checking the York neighborhood, and officers writing reports on what they did. So when they do that, it says fireworks complaint, and it's added into that total. But it wasn't somebody calling; it was us generating that. We'll go to the slide 3 there. So these are our fireworks complaints versus our calls, normal calls for service that day. And on July 1st, the red bar there's our 14 again. And then we had 188 calls for service, other calls, shoplift, traffic accident, whatever you want to call it, on that day. So 14 is included in that 188, and that is consistent across the board. The 26 is part of that 168, and so on. So July 1st, 7% of the calls were fireworks calls. July 2nd, 15% were, and July 3rd, 13%. July 4th, 34% of our calls were fireworks related. And on July 1st, just going back to that, 13 of those 14 calls took place during our emphasis patrols, and again, I'll talk about those in a little bit. July 2nd, 15 of the 26 calls took place when we had emphasis patrols out, and July 3rd, 29 of the 33 took place during the emphasis patrol. I'm going to throw a few more numbers at you here when you're ready. So 52% of all of our fireworks calls took place on July 4th. 82% occurred between the hours of 8 p.m. and midnight. So we had 79 calls of fireworks between 8 p.m. and midnight. During that time, our patrol officers had 42 other calls for service that they were responding to, which included domestic violence, fights, burglaries in progress, stuff like that. But they were able still to handle or respond to and check on at least 26 of those fireworks complaints. Most of them, as we find on any of these fireworks calls, is that we're unable to locate anything by the time they get there. There's a significant time delay, or people just say, hey, it's happening in the neighborhood somewhere, I don't know where. We get there, they see a police car come and they scatter. It's typical. But a lot of times there's a time delay and we just don't get there and we don't contact anybody. And then just in perspective of how many officers we had working that night, between 8 p.m. and 3 a.m. on the 4th, we had 8 officers and 2 sergeants working that day. If you've ever been in the 911 center on the 4th of July, and Chief Hewitt used to be a dispatcher, so he can tell you, it's a zoo. And I think, Chief Dahl, you're going to talk a little bit about how we made some of those calls watch-fors.
Yeah, I want to give you a little bit more perspective as well, and that is, while we did have 12 officers on patrol, there were over 30 personnel that we had assigned to the celebration that was down at the harbor doing traffic control, doing crowd control, making sure that all the venues down there that spread out in the waterfront are safe. But we took a look at the calls that were coming to the 911 center, and remember that the 911 center is receiving complaints Whatcom County wide, is that you see the majority of those fireworks calls coming in all at once within minutes of each other, while at the same time we're responding to calls for service that are potentially violence related, such as domestic disputes, fights, people that need some help who have some mental health issues, especially amplified by what's happening out there with the fireworks celebrations. So what we end up doing for a period of time is making those complaints as watch fors, and some of our community members get upset with that because a watch for is it goes on to the officer's MDC or mobile data computer screen to let them know that if you're in the area, we have a fireworks complaint at this location, but we don't necessarily dispatch someone. And we don't do that because of the sheer number of calls that come in that usually end up mitigating themselves. Within a couple hours, the fireworks calls, of course, die down. And if we're in the area, we go. If we're busy with other things, we simply can't respond. So I don't want people to think that it's not important or a priority for us. It certainly is if we can go there.
If they were to, at the dispatch center, place every one of those 911 fireworks calls on our computer screen that we have in the car, if any of you have been gone on vacation for 2 weeks and come back and check your email, that's what it looks like. And so to ask an officer to weed through and read every one of those fireworks calls and try and prioritize along with everything else that's going on is hard. So the watch for, they air it, they broadcast it, air it means broadcast it over the radio, and they'll put it on a message screen like a text almost on the screen that the officers can go to later and okay, where are these coming from? I can go back there and check that later, but it's there. They have it to reference to, but it's not, the screen is not getting clogged up with all fireworks calls when they do it that way. It's the other stuff that's going on, the other calls for service. We doing okay? Am I rolling through the stats too quick and too much for you here? Slide, is there a question?
You got it.
And just a quick question, though. If there are certain specific areas or households over time that calls for service are kind of near, would that help define emphasis patrols going forward?
It would, yeah. And that's a very good question. And that's something that we want to do next year. And I've got kind of a little bit of a plan I want to tell you about for next year that kind of may address that. So, okay. Let's see here. Slide number 4. So here's calls, fireworks complaints by year since the ordinance went into effect in 2014. And as you can see, we've kind of had a downward trend since the ordinance went into effect. I didn't drill down and look at the rest of the years. I just did the 96 on the 4th of July that we had here in 2017. I haven't looked at the rest of the years on that. So the emphasis patrols, I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and then I'll talk about our plan here in the future. So on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, between 6 p.m. and midnight, we had emphasis patrols out. And that included 2 officers assigned to 1 patrol car. And their sole duty was to respond to fireworks calls throughout the city. Checked on neighborhoods, checked on parks, listened, saw stuff, went there, went to calls based on what was generated that came in through 911. That was 36 hours total of those 3 days, cost of about $2,500. 80% of all the fireworks calls on July 1, 2, and 3 occurred while we had that emphasis patrol working. But like I said earlier, most of their response, they were unable to locate anybody. I think they maybe contacted 5 to 6 people and made them aware of the ordinance. Most of them didn't know, and by the time they got there, most of the folks were honest, and there was no fireworks that we had to confiscate, so no citations were issued, that type of thing. Kind of shows the difficulty enforcement with the time delay. It's all over, and then you get there and they're gone, and you come back and you leave, and then you got to come back because it happens again, and they figure it out. So, okay, and then we did not, as we said earlier, we did not have the emphasis on July 4th because all of our staffing was dealing with the public event that draws everybody from the county down to the waterfront. And so we've got safety concerns there with security, traffic control. It's a huge family event. It's 4th of July, so there may be alcohol involved. So it takes 28 to 30 of us to staff that and do it safely and effectively. And that's why we didn't have the bodies to do an emphasis patrol on the 4th. Now, that's something that I may try and look at doing next year, and I'd like to talk about kind of our lessons learned. So I think what we learned this year is that we really need to enhance our efforts and take kind of a proactive problem-solving approach. And as the saying goes, it takes a village, right? So I think what we can do is we should be reaching out to our neighborhood associations and say, hey, do you have houses in your neighborhood that are continually doing this year after year? Let us know. We'll get our neighborhood police officers to go out there ahead of time, make contact with them and say, hey, you're on notice. This is the ordinance. You've been warned. If this happens, we're coming out. I think we can do continue our partnership with the fire department and Public Works. We've got the reader boards that they put out this year explaining the ordinance, and putting out a press release on the website, City of Bellingham website, and then use of our police department social media, Facebook and the Twitter pages. And based on when the fireworks were happening, we know our emphasis patrols were out at the right places and out on the right dates and the right times. We just need to add it to July 4th, and we need to focus on some of these other neighborhoods where we're getting a lot of complaints. So that's kind of our plan for the future. And I think that is about it. I don't think I had another slide there. And did you have anything else?
No, thank you, Lieutenant Monson. And we learn every year. I think that with the analysis that you see with the neighborhoods, we can do some more enhanced focusing on that. But I think the key, because you hear from your constituents, as do we, that my neighbor has this illegal fireworks display every year. It seems like every single year it goes off. And so our hope is that we can connect with those folks beforehand and do an education piece and let them know what the consequences could be in the ordinance as well. I think that might make a better difference. If we did a regression formula on that, I think we can see that it's a downward trend on calls, and we'd like to keep it that way. So anything more that we could do, we'll certainly do as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for putting in the slides about call for services versus fireworks, because I think that's really important for people to understand. When we passed this ordinance, we knew it wasn't going to stop all fireworks. But what we have seen is it immediately stopped a big percentage of the noise and the fireworks, because people know, and that's what we knew would happen. People know it's illegal, so they don't do it. And we knew the police wouldn't be able to stop everybody, because you have to go where the priority is. And what would you rather do? Stop a firecracker or somebody where there's domestic violence or property crimes and stuff? So we knew that would happen. So I think that's really important that people understand. It's not a matter of not wanting to be out there to do this, but the work of the police force has to go on regarding their general crime.
And on our emphasis patrols, they're out there in a marked car. If they hear a burglary in progress going on, they're not going to go, well, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go just look for the fireworks. Well, if they're in the area, they're going to do that. And they're getting flagged down for other police-related stuff, too, other than fireworks. So we have them out there hoping that they're going to do just fireworks, but life goes on. 911 calls come.
Gene and Roxanne.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. It's obvious that it has had an effect, because I remember the morning of July 4th, it used to start early in the morning and go all night. So I think the window between 8 p.m. and 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. is probably correct. And my wife is president of our little association in the complex we live in, and there was people that were out there doing it, and unbeknownst to me, she went out there on their own and told them of the ordinance. As she left the house, they said, is our life insurance under control here before you walk out the door? But they didn't know, so they stopped immediately. So I think reaching out to the neighborhood association is probably a great idea. We'll never see zero. We knew we'd never see zero, but these are good numbers.
Yeah. I want to say one other thing. On July 5th, there on that slide 2, where it shows 13 calls, 8 of those actually can be attributed to the evening of July 4th, the wee hours of July 5th. It's carryover, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Roxanne?
I also just really want to encourage people to call 911. I don't want them to get dissuaded in thinking, oh, well, the officer didn't show up and they didn't catch the people. The calling 911 and reporting this information really helps us direct our services in the most meaningful way, and it could help us work with the neighborhood associations for future years to solve this over time. So please keep calling 911 and providing those reports.
A lot of them think, well, somebody else is going to call, so I'm not going to call, right? Yeah.
Okay. Pinky?
Thanks, Terry. So I love the idea of us being more proactive on our messaging and doing it collaboratively with the neighborhood associations and the city, but I also thought that maybe we could find a way to loop in Western as well so that they can get messaging out to the students, and then maybe we could do something in the Cascadia Weekly 2 weeks prior, just to find as many outlets as we can, because it has been a couple of years since we passed the ordinance and maybe some people don't know. So any other things that we can do as a collaborative messaging to be proactive would be great.
I will say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the fire department on the jurisdictions outside the city, I believe you guys posted and let them know that it was illegal inside the city to do that too. Is that correct, Chief?
Bill Hewitt, Assistant Fire Chief, and yes, that's correct. We take on a lot of the public relation part of this, and one of those is, we have an agreement with the county fire marshal. When they permit stands in the county, they actually have the stands post on there that fireworks are illegal in the city. So that's a partnership we have. One of the other things that, when you asked about the Cascadia Weekly and that, this year, Ron Richard, our fire marshal, along with Mitch Knowles, who's one of the inspectors for Whatcom County, got together with Captain Pethick here in the back of the room, did a hour-long Facebook Live event talking about fireworks regulations in the city, in the county, how they work together. And it actually spurred 2 different articles in the Herald, the information that came out of that. Don't control what the press decides to print, but we definitely made an impact on getting the information out there. So,
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you for coming in today, and yeah, good report. Yeah, keep up the good work.